So these are science slides for solutions or solubility of a substance. So remember to listen to me read the slides, and then when you study, you can read out loud to yourself. So question, what happens to a substance when you put it in water? And then we made a prediction about different substances, what they would do in water. So for example, salt, what happens to salt when you put it and stir it in water? Sand, what happens to sand when you put it and stir it in water? I predict that the sand will. And we also, after we realized what salt and sand did in water, we also investigated other substances like coffee, and we asked, will the coffee act more like salt and sugar in water, or will it act more like sand? Is flour soluble or insoluble? Okay, so flour is soluble, it will act more like salt and sugar. If it's insoluble, it will act more like sand. Will the flour act more like salt, sugar, and coffee in water, or will it act more like sand? Sand is insoluble. So we made our predictions. We also observed oil, cooking oil. Will oil act more like salt, sugar, and coffee, or more like sand? And we made predictions. We recorded the results on our table. We put a spoonful of each substance in a beaker, and we stirred the substance for 30 seconds in class, and we made observations and recorded them. So we wrote down our observations. So again, how do you know something is soluble? Well, if you can see the parts of the substance in water, or if it makes the water cloudy, if you see parts of a substance settle to the top or bottom of the water, then the substance is insoluble. Okay, so if you answer yes to any of these questions on the table, the answer is insoluble. So these were our results of the table and whether or not each substance was soluble or insoluble. So for example, we have salt. When we put it in water and stirred it, we could not see the salt. It didn't make the water cloudy. We couldn't see it go to the bottom of the beaker, so we determined it was soluble. No to both questions. But sand, we said yes. We tried to stir it, leave it in the water, but you could still see the substance. It made the water cloudy. You could see grains of sand at the bottom, so sand is insoluble. And then there are other results there for you to look at. So again, these were the questions we asked to determine if a substance like sand or coffee was insoluble or soluble. There's water that looks cloudy and also not cloudy. Here is dissolve. I explained dissolve in a different video, so you can read that to yourself. Dissolve. So the solid substances that we tested were either lump, like you see a picture of this substance coal, or powder, like the other picture. So sand was powder, salt was powder, lump was like the rock sugar that we used, and we know that powder as well as lump substances can dissolve if they're soluble. So just because they're lump doesn't mean they can't dissolve as long as they're soluble. So here's a solubility diagram. So sand plus water is a mixture but not a solution because it's insoluble. This is an example of a solution. So when you look at the solution, that you don't see blue grains of berry powder floating on the top, and the substance is not cloudy. So here's a picture of the rock sugar that dissolved in the water. We determined it was not cloudy. And when you study, you can read and say blank substance is soluble because it, or blank substance is insoluble because it, to give a reason. This is just reminding us that we drew a diagram that looked somewhat like this picture. We identified the solvent, solute, solution, and insoluble substance in each diagram. Labeling is important, so remember to label. You should have your diagrams labeled in your notebook, so look at your notebook to check that you did that. So again, soluble describes a substance that can dissolve in a solvent like water. Salt, sugar, and coffee are examples of soluble substances. Even lump sugar cubes, like you see in this picture, can dissolve. Solute is a substance that dissolves in water. That's what we call a solute. That's the thing. And solutes are soluble. So solute plus solvent equals solution. Here's another way to look at that. It's a mixture. A solution is a mixture with a substance that can dissolve. Here's another example of a solution. It's yellow water. It's not cloudy. You don't see the food coloring on top of the water or on the bottom. It's spread throughout. It's what we call a uniform substance. Here's another example of a solution, soda water. It's a mixture of gas and water. So we have carbon dioxide and water. This is just for your information. We did not investigate a solution composed of gas and water. This is the same way to explain soluble and insoluble substances using conjunctions because or so. Sand plus water is insoluble. What is insoluble? Insoluble describes a substance that does not dissolve in a solvent like water. Sand, flour, and oil are insoluble. Blank is insoluble because blank, so it is insoluble. So just two different ways to explain why a substance is insoluble using because or so. Try to use both conjunctions. This is a picture that shows an insoluble substance. Sand is not a solute, even if you put it in a solvent, so it's not a solution. And this is just more ways to explain solute. When you study, you have this to read out loud to yourself when you study. So remember, if you have a solution, you take out the solvent like water, then the other part is the solute. So we learned in class that solutions can be separated. If you take out the solute from the solution, then you get the solvent. The other part is the solvent. So we concluded that solutions can be separated. If you take away the solvent, you are left with the solute. If you take away the solute, you are left with the solvent. Mixing salt and water is a solution because How can you separate the solution of salt and water? What apparatuses did we use to do that? So in our solutions conclusion, we use the words solvent, solute, solution, soluble, insoluble, dissolve, powder, lump, rock sugar, salt, flour, coffee, sand, and oil. So you wrote, from my results, I can conclude that soluble substances, blank. I also learned that insoluble substances, blank. Look at your notebook for more information. So again, we always want to think about how can we make every investigation a fair test, like a fair race. We did a few experiments, investigations, about these questions. It says, does more heat make a solute dissolve faster? So we know a solute dissolves, but how can we make it dissolve faster? And does the grain size affect how fast a solute dissolves? So what dissolves faster, lump or powder? So we discuss what makes a fair test for this question. We said the variable, the different factor, was the temperature of the water. And for this question, the variable is the size of the substance, of the solute. Everything else should be the same for this question.